All right, so still with project planning, just thought it would be important to introduce this whole notion of plan-driven development, just because it's somewhat applicable to the initial plans that we are going to devise in the respective groups that we're working or that we are a part of. A key thing here to note is, just thought I would say this from the outset. It turns out that plan-driven development is typically associated with the software development process that requires proper planning prior, right? And I know this should ring bells in your head. So things to do with the traditional waterfall model, for instance, right? It's one of those processes that we looked at or discussed that requires prior proper planning before you embark upon the subsequent activities or phases, right? And it's typically applicable to so-called large-scale software projects, right? And also something worth mentioning here is that the agile-centric planning process is going to be discussed once we look at the agile development process. So we won't discuss it in this lecture series. All right, so this plan-driven approach or plan-based development approach is nothing more than a technique or an approach to software engineering where the development process is comprehensively planned, right, on inception. And usually this planning or plan-based development is typically based on project management techniques loosely associated with the traditional way of developing software or managing large pieces of software, aka things like the waterfall model, for instance. So what typically happens during plan-driven development, obviously, is a plan is created that records the work activities that are going to be done as part of the project. Not only that, you come up with a detailed schedule associated with work activities and then spell out exactly what sort of output products are going to be produced as part of the project. Right? So key things here is your detailed plan needs to record the work activities or the work that is going to be done, who is going to do that work, so the individuals that are going to be part of the project, the detailed schedule associated with the work that is going to be done, specifics of the timelines, right? What is going to be done in month 1, month 2, month 3, right? All the way up to month X or something. And then the products, right, that are going to be produced as part of the project, all the documentation, the software artifacts, and plans that you're going to have to devise, or the different software artifacts. Like I said, this doesn't necessarily have to be the software related to the software system, but it could be design artifacts, for instance. And so typically these project managers will use the detailed plan to support them in their day-to-day decision-making processes, right? And more importantly, the project managers will use that detailed plan to measure the relative progress or to assess the relative progress of the project. So in terms of the advantages associated with the so-called plan-driven approach here or development, obviously the obvious advantage here is that prior planning allows one or project managers to take into account all different organizational issues. So things to do with members of staff that are going to be required to work on the project, right? Because you'd have a comprehensive plan beforehand, you'd potentially know exactly how many people you need to hire, right? Also, obviously, because you come up with a detailed plan, you already know how you're going to cope with potential problems that are going to come your way, right, as you're executing the project. Right, so this is part of risk management, obviously. And also dependencies associated with the project are discovered before you actually initiate the project. Compare and contrast with the situation where you maybe use a different approach, an approach aligned with, let's say, an agile technique or process, you'd only get to discover problems and dependencies once the project is underway, right? And this is a bad idea for large-scale software projects. It might be okay for a small-scale project like one you're working on, but definitely not for a large-scale project. So in terms of the disadvantages here, obviously, the disadvantage is that the decisions that you make early on, right? Because you have this comprehensive plan, the decisions that you make early on might potentially need to be revised as your project environment changes, right? So all in all, this so-called plan-driven development project approach really takes the shape and form where a project plan will set out the resources available at the project, specific breakdown of the work that is going to be done as part of the project, and the schedule, right? And typically the sort of sections that are aligned with this plan or this approach really would be things like the introduction, project organization, right? How the project is going to be organized, anything to do with risk management, right? These will all go into these will all be taken into account when it comes to this plan-driven development approach. The hardware and software resources that are required as part of the project, the detailed work breakdown, right? And we discuss work breakdown structures shortly. The detailed project schedule has to be part of this plan. And more importantly, mechanisms that you've put in place to monitor and report the progress of the project, right? Remember, this whole monitoring process and reporting process is a continuous process, right? So you need to constantly monitor the progress being made in the project. Right, so the process of planning is quite simple, really. All you have to do is ensure that you regularly amend the project as work is being done, right? It's not like you do your initial planning and then you just pack your plan. You need to constantly monitor, right? As you are monitoring, whatever requires change must be amended, right? Whatever issue needs to be changed needs to be amended, right? Course correction is important. And course correction is not just tied to the actual project plan, but other things associated with the project, like the schedule itself, cost estimate, and the risks associated with the project. So if you realize to say an activity associated with a project that was supposed to be completed in the month of April is not going to be completed in the month of April, then you obviously need to adjust your schedule somehow. Or perhaps you need to engage other people to be included as part of that project so that you complete that particular activity on time. So this block diagram essentially just provides a visual representation of the process I was talking about, where, or the process discussed in the previous slide here, where you identify first of all, set out to identify the constraints associated with the project. You come up with a comprehensive list of all risks, right? As part of the risk management process, all the risks associated with the project, you identify the risks. You clearly define the milestones and the deliverables associated with the project, right? So milestones are nothing more than just key points in the project, and the deliverables would be actual byproducts of the project, right? Actual tangible products that you produce as part of this project, so documentation and design artifacts and the actual software. And then using these three inputs here, you come up with a schedule, right? Of course, the project manager will have to come up with his project schedule here, right? And then work is done, right? At the same time, the project manager will start monitoring the progress against the plan, right? Monitor the progress, people are doing the work, right? Is the work unfinished? Is it unfinished or not? If it's finished, then you finish the project. If not, you check if there are problems. If there are no problems, then you continue with the schedule, right? Or if there are no problems or minor problems, you continue with the schedule. Otherwise, if there are problems, right, that have been encountered, what you do is you go to your risk management plan and initiate any risk mitigation actions that you'd have outlined as part of your risk management plan, right? What you also do is you replan, because there are serious problems, you need to rework or you course correct, right? So hopefully this whole planning process makes sense. Of course, there are certain assumptions that need to be taken into account here as part of planning. You obviously have to be realistic about things here. Very important. No need to be optimistic. You want to make sure that you're realistic as you're defining a plan. It's usually a good idea that you overestimate the number of people that are required to work on a particular activity rather than underestimate, for instance, right? That's being realistic. So rather than say, oh, we expect just one developer to work on this particular feature of the software, you're better off saying, oh, maybe we need 2 or 3 people to actually work on this particular feature of the software. So something else that you need to take into account as far as assumptions are concerned here is that problems will always arise as part of the project, right? And they'll potentially lead to project delays. So you want to anticipate these problems. And so it goes without saying then that the initial assumptions that you make as part of the initial plan of the project here, right, might potentially result in things that are unexpected. And so you have to brace yourself and prepare for those different things. And then also you need to come up with a contingency plan, a workaround, right, in the event that something wrong does occur, because something wrong will always occur. People will resign, for instance, right? So you hire 4 programmers. Don't think that those 4 programmers will be a part of the project until you complete the project. Some of the programmers might just decide to leave and go elsewhere midway through the project, right? Life happens. Sorry to say this, but maybe they'll die, right? But in terms of these group projects that you're working on, maybe something that you need to, an assumption that you need to take into account is that perhaps not everybody is going to contribute equally to the relative success of the project. Some people might laze around and might not contribute their equal share of the project. So these are all assumptions that you need to take into account, right? You need to devise a proper risk management plan for that. And so this brings us to this whole notion of mitigating potential risks associated with the project or tied to planning here. If you identify or notice that there are serious problems with the development work, what you need to do is you initiate risk mitigation actions that are part of risk management. And the goal really of risk mitigation is to try and reduce the risks associated with the project, right? Fundamentally, what you're trying to avoid is a situation where the project fails. That's the last thing you'd want to happen. And of course, tied to these mitigation actions, like we said in this flowchart here, is that you need to constantly replan the project, right? In certain instances, this might involve you meeting your customers and trying to negotiate certain things, perhaps try and negotiate the timelines associated with the project. You negotiate features associated with the software project. So maybe you go to your customer and tell them, say, you know what, we initially said we were going to incorporate this particular feature into the software system, but perhaps it will not be possible right now. Maybe we can defer this to a later stage. Right. Once you negotiate with your customers, it might be necessary for you to come up with a revised schedule of the work. Right. I know what you're thinking, and no, it's not going to happen. There'll be nothing like renegotiating with the customer who is light on for our respective projects here. There's nothing like renegotiating the deadlines associated with the project, right? But in the real world, it is possible for you to negotiate. All right, so next up, we're going to look at project scheduling.